commodity-based economy has done as well, not only in terms of LNG, not only in terms of just natural gas production, but when you go down the value-added chain, which you're dealing with methanol, urea, and potash, etc., those are getting huge prices on the international market. But what is a blessing is also a curse, because as you know, that just a few years back, a lot of the big companies were signaling that they were leaving Trinidad. And they were leaving Trinidad because their shareholders were not seeing return on their investment. So the biggest challenge for us today is to get the government, and I mean, I would say over time, that's not just in the last few years, but the biggest challenge is to get the diversification and implementation. I think that is some of the biggest problems, and also dealing with the root cause of crime in the country. I think there is a reluctance to face the reality of the root cause of crime.
Which is?
Well, what I spoke about, the underground economy, the money laundering, and for whatever reason, that is not being addressed. You're passing the legislation because FATF and FATF probably will put you on the greatest blacklist, and of course you're running those risks. So you have to pass the legislation, the anti-money laundering legislation, the poker legislation. Yes, you're seeing the legislation passed. You can't say the legislation isn't there. So the problem is, are you seeing the results of that legislation? Because you're not passing legislation just because to fulfill a mandate. You want to see results. And when it comes to dealing with crime, I mean, our crime level, I mean, you know, I feel almost like a bit of I feel conflicted, because I'm not seeing the nice things that I would like to say about my country, which means that we are very educated. We have UTT, University of Trinidad and Tobago. We also have 3 universities, the University of the West Indies. We have our faculty of agriculture, one of the longest, least established faculties of agriculture. A highly educated population. Highly educated, not only through the public institutions, but also through the private institutions that got gate funding. So there's no question about that. There's a level of sophistication in our country that I think is measurable to what we will call developed nation status. The diversity of our population in terms of race, ethnicity, religion, which in itself can create its own problems, also makes it very, very attractive. So we have a competitive advantage which none of the others have. And we are the home of Calypso. Just want to make it clear. Just to make it clear, we are the home of Calypso. And I want to make it clear, we are the home of steel band. Yes, Trinidad and Tobago is the home of steel band. So that's
duly noted.
Yeah, I hope it's duly noted, because of course we're happy for every other country to play our steel band and play our Calypso. But we want them to understand it came from us. And so it talks about a very creative people.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Let me ask you, you talked about diversification. So you're, being reliant on energy can be a blessing and a curse.
Yes.
Right now prices are very high, so it's a blessing. It leads to Dutch disease, which is inflationary, to simplify the concept of Dutch disease. There's been talk here in the United States about whether or not Chevron might get a license to do more work in Venezuela, whether there might be a pipeline.
Partnership. The reality is, when it comes on the local level, which poor person in our country can come and participate in public-private partnership? Which poor person, I even want to...
But isn't the notion that a public-private partnership is perhaps more efficient than a government run, and then there will be more people employed?
Right, so that is the theory. So Central Bank did a paper, and in fact one of the persons who benefits from the public-private partnership called me up and said, I see you writing something about public-private partnership. I said, well, I wrote about it from Central Bank, because they did a study, and they found that a lot of times, it's so much. The reality is, we do not have a procurement legislation. We have something called the Central Tenants Board Act, and the difference is, with the procurement legislation, you have to have your design finished, they monitor it, and they go to and they also can stop the project. Right now, the Central Tenants Board Act can do none of that. So what happens a lot of times is they give unfinished designs, which are approved, which increased costs, and because of course you're adding on to the.
So it's not as efficient as it would be.
And they did a study with one of them to really look at whether public-private partnerships within the local environment really worked, and the answer was no. So it's all nice for us to talk all the nice things. So you ask me what I would say I would like to see diversification in our cultural tourism, because we have what Mauritius has. We have much of what it has. We have Napa, Sapa, you know what that is, but that's we have the venues, we have the educated people, we have education in event planning, in theatre and in arts, so we are ready for cultural tourism and also agro industry. We want to do this with Belize, that send their bananas and their oranges to the first world countries, send it to us. And we can develop the agro industry and for the CARICOM region so that we stop importing 80% of our food. Do you know we import 80% of our food? $5.7 billion goes into food import. And then you want to know why are we importing certain things into the country? Do you know how many international, these, what you call them? I don't want to call the names because I want to be careful, but franchises, which bring low value, dead-end jobs to our country, make huge profits. They just published one of them, I don't want to call the name, but in money they said they made to date for the year was 841 million TT dollars. Just one, and bringing in these franchises, using up our foreign exchange, and creating low value jobs.
Can I
so passionate? I'm sorry.
So when you talk about FDI and quality investment,
yes.
Here we are, our first question. What can we do that makes us your first source of capital dollars rather than China?
We don't want that Belt Road initiative. You don't want me to give you the example with the 5,500 houses that was entered into in a framework agreement that they had to scuttle it because when it came out through the Freedom of Information Act, the Chinese company had been blacklisted by the World Bank, and all of a sudden they found out we shouldn't do that. So we want American investment because we understand America is serious about fiscal integrity, we are serious about monetary integrity, and we know that with America supporting us, we can deal with the scourge of crime and criminality, which is the underbelly that is keeping Trinidad and Tobago from reaching its full potential.
And on that, we'll end it there. Thank you so much. Inflationaries, to simplify the concept of Dutch disease. There's been talk here in the United States about whether or not Chevron might get a license to do more work in Venezuela, whether there might be a pipeline from Venezuela to Trinidad and Tobago because you've got unused capacity, as I understand it, when it comes to natural gas. Is that something that you would like to have in? Is that
Absolutely. But what I want to just say, I will answer that question. Yeah. But what I wanted to say is that what I think is the major challenge in Trinidad is what they call the Gini coefficient. We always like to talk about GDP, even GDP per capita, and we sound good. Sounds very good to tell people that. But the problem is if you apply the Gini coefficient, which will really tell you the spread of that so-called GDP, gross domestic value, in our fiscal period.
It's like a measure of income inequality,
income
right?
spread, exactly. And the income spread, since 1991, they stopped doing it. And it is very clear. I mean, I'm sorry to have to say it, but you just need to read the newspapers and you hear what people are saying. The money seems to be concentrated in very few hands. And the legislation that they will not pass, have not passed, will not implement for the last 7 years. I mean, how many times have I heard them speak about the National Statistical Institute? You cannot manage what you don't measure. How many times have I heard about the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority? How many times have I heard about the Gambling Commission? So we have unregulated, what they call them, members club, which our own minister in the first 2 years said we have the most unregulated private members club in the world. And up to now you can't pass the legislation. So the problem is, I'm connecting that with the fact that whilst the prices of oil and gas, and this is the other point, when you talk about the GDP went up from 140 million to 180 million within the last 3 months. Well, this year, the minister, I was happy to hear him say real GDP, because we have said, stop saying GDP, because you can't really measure whether there's really been production or whether there's been growth by using GDP. When you use real GDP, you're going to see the impact on inflation on those goods and services. And when you factored up the inflation, our real GDP was much less than they had portrayed. And that was because we have not produced anything more, we have not created anything more, any substance, and that is because the price was really the increasing price of oil and gas. I'm sorry to say all of this. I'm sorry to sit here in front of you to say that about my country, but the reality is that we're dealing with the Gini coefficient, the inequality in the spread of our wealth, the fact that the government has failed to implement the legislation which for the budget one every year you hear me implementing, and nothing's been done. And it seems to me that the people benefit. And I want to say something on the public-private partnership.
I just want to say one more thing. You're running for prime minister.
So what I had in mind.
I just want to point out because you're running for prime minister. I think you're the platform.
I've been saying this for the last 3-4 years.
No, I don't doubt that.
Yeah, so I mean, if that's how it comes across, that's not the intention.
But you, the one thing you were saying about public-private partnerships.
Right. So the public-private partnership sounds wonderful, improving, and I'm glad to hear it. But public-private partnership takes a lot of people out of the opportunities, because it become a public. I'm talking about on the local sphere, not
as opposed to the government doing the work.
Well, we encourage that. I mean, one foreign direct investment.
Yeah.
I am saying that straight. We want and welcome foreign direct investment. Importantly, to deal with our crime, which is out of hand, 460 murders to date for this year.